It was a Tuesday, the 30th of January, 1649. The air in London was bitter, a piercing cold that seemed to seep into the very stones of the city. Outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, a crowd of thousands had gathered, packed shoulder to shoulder in the streets and onto the rooftops. They were a sea of English faces, apprentices, merchants, soldiers, and stunned nobility, waiting in a silence so profound, so unnatural, that contemporary accounts describe it as a physical weight pressing down upon the capital. They were not waiting for a coronation, or a festival, or a proclamation of war. They were waiting to see the impossible. At the center of this hushed theater stood a low wooden scaffold, draped entirely in black. It was surrounded by ranks of soldiers, grim-faced men in thick wool coats, their muskets loaded, their eyes scanning the restless mob. These were not the shining knights of medieval law, nor the liveried retainers of a great lord. They were the new model army, the first professional fighting force in English history, and they stood as the iron wall between the people and the man who was about to die. When that man stepped out onto the scaffold, he did so with a composure that unnerved his enemies. Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, wore 2 shirts that morning. He had explicitly requested the extra layer, fearful that the biting cold might make him shiver and that the crowd might mistake his shivering for fear. He would not give them that satisfaction. He was a man who had lost every battle, squandered every advantage, and plunged his 3 kingdoms into a decade of fire and blood. Yet in this final moment, he played the part of the martyr with absolute perfection. To the modern mind, it is difficult to grasp the sheer cosmic horror of what was about to happen. In the 17th century, a king was not merely a head of state. He was the anointed of God. He ruled by divine right, a concept that placed him above the laws of men, answerable only to the Almighty. To strike a king was treason. To kill a king was a sacrilege indistinguishable from blasphemy. It was to strike at God himself. For 1,000 years of British history, kings had died in battle or been quietly murdered in dark dungeon cells by ambitious rivals. But never, never had a king been put on trial by his own subjects, sentenced by a court of law, and publicly executed in broad daylight outside his own palace. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the axe fell. It was a dull, heavy sound that echoed across Whitehall. A witness in the crowd, a young boy named Philip Henry, would later write that as the king's head was severed, there rose from the thousands of spectators such a groan as I never heard before, and desire I may never hear again. It was a sound of collective trauma, a realization that the world they knew, the ordered hierarchy of God, king, and subject, had been shattered beyond repair. The executioner lifted the head, but he did not shout the traditional words, "Behold the head of a traitor." He simply held it up, his face masked, while the blood of a divinely appointed monarch soaked into the wooden planks. But this story is not about Charles Stuart. It is not about the victim of that January afternoon. It is about the architect. Somewhere behind the scenes, amidst the smoke-filled committee rooms and the prayer circles of the army officers, stood the man who had driven this tragedy to its grim conclusion. He was a man who, just a decade earlier, had been a complete nobody, a struggling tenant farmer in the flat, damp fens of East Anglia, drowning in debt, battling a crippling depression, and utterly unknown to the wider world. He was a commoner with a harsh, unfashionable accent, a face scarred by warts and weather, and a temper that could swing from tearful prayer to cold, ruthless violence in the blink of an eye. His name was Oliver Cromwell. How did this happen? How did a man who spent the first 40 years of his life inspecting sheep and arguing with local magistrates rise to become the most powerful individual in the British Isles? How did an untrained civilian, with no military education whatsoever, forge a fighting machine that crushed the Royalist Cavalier elite, conquered Ireland, subdued Scotland, and struck terror into the great empires of Europe? The execution of the king was the moment the world broke, but it was also the moment that revealed the terrifying clarity of Cromwell's vision. While others dithered, seeking compromise, terrified of the anarchy that might follow the death of a monarch, Cromwell saw only the hand of Providence. He believed, with a terrifying certainty, that God had judged Charles Stuart. And if God had judged him, then it was Cromwell's duty, his holy burden, to carry out the sentence, no matter how much the world groaned in protest. To understand this moment, and to understand the man who would eventually become the only commoner to ever truly rule England as a dictator, we must look past the black velvet of the scaffold. We must look back to a time when the three kingdoms were drifting toward an abyss, guided by a king who believed he could do no wrong, and opposed by a collection of country gentlemen who had no idea how to fight a war. We often speak of history as being made by great forces, economics, religion, geography, but sometimes history is bent by the sheer, indomitable will of a single impossible personality. Oliver Cromwell was a paradox, a man who destroyed a monarchy to save a parliament he would later dissolve at gunpoint, a man who championed liberty of conscience while enforcing a Puritan tyranny, a man who called himself a humble servant while wielding more absolute power than any medieval despot. On that cold day in January, as the blood dried on the scaffold and the crowd dispersed in stunned silence, the old England died. The divine right of kings was severed along with Charles's head. In its place rose something new, something terrifying, and something forged entirely in the image of the Fenland farmer. The king was dead. The age of the iron soldier had begun. To understand how a farmer found himself holding the axe of history, we must leave the cold streets of London and travel back to a world that was, quite literally, setting itself on fire. Understand the blood that soaked the planks of the scaffold in 1649, we must step back from the edge of the abyss and look at the road that led there. It was not a short road, nor was it paved with sudden, impulsive decisions. It was a slow, grinding descent into a national nightmare, forged in the silence of a kingdom where the people had lost their voice. If you were to walk through the streets of London in the late 1630s, on the surface, you would have seen a country at peace. The fields were being tilled, the ships were landing at the docks, and the church bells rang on Sundays. But underneath this veneer of calm, the foundation of England was rotting. For 11 long years, from 1629 to 1640, the doors of Parliament remained locked. This was the era of the personal rule, or as his enemies would later call it, the 11 years' tyranny. Charles I, convinced of his own divinity, had decided that he had no need for the voices of his subjects. He would rule alone, guided only by his conscience and his God. In his mind, he was the benevolent father of the nation, and a father does not ask his children for permission to govern. But a father who ignores his children eventually breeds resentment, and Charles was a man uniquely gifted at turning loyalty into hatred. Without a parliament to grant taxes, the king resorted to archaic and dubious methods to fill his treasury. He dusted off medieval statutes that had been forgotten for centuries, fining gentlemen for not receiving knighthoods and taxing inland towns for a navy that they would never see. He turned the law into a weapon of extortion. But it was not just the theft of gold that poisoned the well, it was the theft of souls. To the vast majority of Englishmen, religion was not a matter of private preference, it was the defining structure of reality. And the king, along with his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, was tampering with that reality. They began to reintroduce ritual, ceremony, and hierarchy into the Church of England. To the modern eye, these changes might seem trivial: the position of an altar, the wearing of a surplice, the railing off of the communion table. But to the growing Puritan faction, men and women who believed in a stripped-back, Bible-centric faith, this was nothing short of a return to the hated tyranny of Rome. They smelled the incense of popery. They saw the king leading their country back into the dark, superstitious embrace of Catholicism. Dissent was not tolerated. The primary instrument of the king's will was the Court of Star Chamber, a legal body that operated without a jury and without appeal. It became a byword for arbitrary cruelty. When three Puritan gentlemen, Prynne, Burton, and Bastwick, dared to write pamphlets criticizing the bishops, the response of the state was medieval in its ferocity. They were hauled before the Star Chamber, fined ruinous amounts, and sentenced to have their ears hacked off in the pillory. As the executioner's blade sliced through their flesh in Palace Yard, they did not beg for mercy. They preached to the crowd. The blood that fell on the stones that day watered the seeds of a revolution. The silence of the personal rule was not the silence of contentment. It was the silence of a pressure cooker, the valves screwed down tight, the heat rising, waiting for the metal to fatigue and the vessel to burst. When the explosion finally came, it was triggered not by English rebels, but by the Scots, who invaded in 1640 to reject Charles's religious meddling. Bankrupt and humiliated, the king had no choice. He had to unlock the doors. He had to recall Parliament. But the men who arrived at Westminster were not in a mood to negotiate. They were in a mood to settle scores. The atmosphere was toxic. Trust had completely evaporated. Every attempt at compromise failed because neither side believed a word the other said. The slide from political deadlock to open warfare was terrifyingly fast. By August 1642, the king had left London. On a blustery day in Nottingham, he raised his royal standard, a large battle flag signalling the start of hostilities. It was a grim omen that the standard was almost immediately blown down by a fierce storm, landing in the mud. But the die was cast. The king declared war on his own people. As the two sides mobilized, the terrifying reality of the situation became clear. On paper, the Parliamentarians, derisively nicknamed Roundheads for their cropped hair, held the advantages of wealth. They controlled London, the Customs House, and the Navy. But war is not fought with ledgers, it is fought with men. And here, the disparity was laughable. The Royalist forces, the Cavaliers, were the natural warriors of the age. These were the sons of the aristocracy and the gentry. They had grown up in the saddle. They knew how to hunt, how to fence, and how to shoot. They possessed a culture of martial honor and personal bravery. Their commander, the king's nephew Prince Rupert of the Rhine, was a dashing, terrifying figure who had learned the art of war in the brutal conflicts of Europe. He brought with him a cavalry force that was aggressive, fast, and utterly dismissive of their opponents. Facing them was a parliamentary army that can only be described as a rabble. It was a collection of city apprentices, tapsters, unemployed weavers, and old serving men. They were commanded by aristocrats who had been chosen for their political status rather than their tactical acumen. They had no drill, no discipline, and no idea of the horror that was coming for them. They were soft men, drawn from the shops and the fields, handed pikes and muskets they barely knew how to hold, and told to stand against the flower of the English nobility. The early skirmishes were embarrassing. The parliamentarian troops would often break and run at the mere sight of a royalist charge. There was no cohesion. A regiment from one county would refuse to march into the next. Officers were more concerned with their pay than with drilling their men. To any objective observer, the war was a foregone conclusion. The king's cavaliers would sweep these shopkeepers aside, march on London, and hang the ringleaders before Christmas. But amidst this chaotic, incompetent mess, there was one man watching with a growing sense of fury. He was a minor member of Parliament for Cambridge, a man with no military experience, standing in the back of the room, observing the disorganized shambles of the parliamentary war effort. He saw the old, decaying serving men and the tapsters running from the Cavaliers. He saw the impending massacre. He realized, with a clarity that eluded everyone else, that you cannot fight a spirit of honor with a spirit of commerce. To beat the king, they would need something stronger than money. They would need a new kind of spirit entirely. But for now, the kingdom was ablaze, the king's horses were thundering across the Midlands, and the forces of Parliament were walking blindly into a slaughter. If Oliver Cromwell had died in the year 1640, at the age of 41, he would have been remembered by absolutely no one. He would have been a historical ghost, a name recorded in a dusty parish register in Huntingdonshire, perhaps noted briefly as a man who squandered his inheritance and died in obscurity. There would be no statues, no biographies, and certainly no debate about whether he was a hero or a monster. He would simply have been another forgotten Englishman in a century full of them. To understand the colossus who would eventually shatter the British monarchy, we must first confront the failure. And failure is not too strong a word. By the standards of his class and his time, the early life of Oliver Cromwell was a disaster. Born into the lower rungs of the gentry, he was the poor relation of a wealthy family. His uncle was a grand figure who entertained kings. Oliver was the nephew who managed to slide down the social ladder with alarming speed. The landscape of his life was the Fens, that flat, waterlogged expanse of East Anglia where the sky seems to press down upon the earth. It was a gloomy, damp and isolated world, prone to ague and fevers, and it perfectly matched the interior landscape of Cromwell's mind. We often picture him as the iron-willed general, unshakable and stern. But the man who walked the muddy fields of St. Ives in the 1630s was a man on the brink of a nervous breakdown. The medical records of the time give us a glimpse into his torment. He was a hypochondriac, constantly convinced he was on the verge of death. He visited a prominent London physician, Dr. Theodore de Mayen, who noted in his casebook that this Mr. Cromwell was valder melancholicus, extremely melancholic. He was prone to sudden, violent mood swings, bouts of deep depression, and a terrifying, restless energy that had nowhere to go. He was a man at war with himself long before he was at war with the king. This internal chaos was mirrored by his external ruin. Through a combination of bad luck and poor management, he was forced to sell his ancestral land. This was a humiliation of the highest order. In 17th century England, land was status. To lose it was to lose one's place in the great chain of being. He fell from being a landed gentleman to a tenant farmer, renting land to graze cattle and sheep. He was a man who had failed to provide for his station, a man seemingly abandoned by fortune. But it was in this pit of despair, in the dark silence of the Fenland nights, that something broke inside Oliver Cromwell, and when it broke, it was replaced by something harder than steel. He underwent a profound, violent spiritual conversion. He did not just become religious, he was consumed by the fire of a radical, uncompromising Calvinism. He emerged from his depression with the absolute, unshakable conviction that he had been saved. In a letter to a cousin, he described his former self with brutal honesty. "I was a chief, the chief of sinners. This is true, I hated godliness, yet God had mercy on me." This is the key that unlocks the entire mystery of the Civil War. Cromwell believed, with a literalness that is terrifying to the modern mind, in the doctrine of providence. He believed that God had personally reached down into the muck of St. Ives, plucked him, a wretch, a failure, a sinner, from the abyss, and chosen him for a purpose. He didn't know what that purpose was yet, but the psychological transformation was total. A man who believes he has been chosen by God fears no man. He fears no king, he fears no army. The crippling doubt that had plagued him was replaced by a terrifying certainty. He was now an instrument of the divine will. When he was eventually elected to Parliament for Cambridge in 1640, he arrived at Westminster not as a polished politician, but as a force of nature. We have a description of him from this time, written by a Royalist observer, Sir Philip Warwick. It is one of the most vivid portraits in English history. Warwick describes seeing a gentleman speaking in the House, very ordinarily apparelled, in a plain cloth suit that looked like it had been made by a bad country tailor. His linen was plain and not very clean. His sword was stuck close to his side. His voice was sharp and untunable, and his eloquence was full of fervour. The courtly gentlemen of London didn't know what to make of him. They saw a rough, angry country farmer with a swollen, reddish face and a temper that flared at the slightest provocation. They saw a man who lacked the graces of the aristocracy, but what they failed to see was the dangerous intensity burning behind those eyes. They saw a rustic. They should have seen a revolutionary. Cromwell sat in those early sessions of Parliament, watching the debates, watching the king's arrogance, and watching the drift toward war. He was not a leader yet. He was a backbencher, a minor figure. But while others debated legal technicalities and precedents, Cromwell saw the world in binary terms. There was God's work, and there were the enemies of God. As the summer of 1642 approached, and the drums of war began to beat in the shires, the failed farmer finally found his vocation. The restless energy that had driven him to the doctor's office, the melancholia that had haunted his nights, suddenly found a focal point. The purpose he had been waiting for was revealed. He was not meant to be a farmer. He was not meant to be a politician. He was meant to be the sword of the Lord. He returned to his home in the eastern counties, but he did not go back to his sheep. He went to the marketplace in Cambridge. He seized the magazine of weapons at Cambridge Castle to prevent it from falling into Royalist hands, an act of high treason that could have seen him hanged before the war even officially began. He began to recruit men, not many at first, just a single troop of 60 cavalry. But these were not just any men. Cromwell looked at the tapsters and serving men that made up the rest of the parliamentary army and sneered. He went back to what he knew. He went to the Puritans. He recruited the sons of freeholders, men of religion, men who feared God and nothing else. He began to instill in them the same iron discipline that he had imposed upon his own soul. The fenland farmer was gone. In his place stood Captain Cromwell. He was 43 years old, he had never commanded soldiers in his life, and he was about to change the art of war forever. The man who had failed at everything was about to teach the king a lesson in success. The war began not with a bang, but with a collision of incompetence and adrenaline. In October 1642, the two great armies of England finally stumbled into one another on the slopes of Edgehill in Warwickshire. It was late in the year, the ground was hardening with the coming frost, and neither side was truly ready for the butchery that was about to commence. If you had stood on the ridge that afternoon, looking down into the valley, you would have witnessed the terrified birth of the English Civil War. On one side stood the king's army, resplendent in their confidence, their banners snapping in the wind, commanded by men who had been raised from birth to believe in their own superiority. On the other stood the army of Parliament, a vast, confused mass of orange tawny scarves led by the Earl of Essex, a man who brought his own coffin with him on the campaign, a grim testament to his lack of optimism. The Battle of Edgehill was a messy, bloody draw. It was a brawl rather than a tactical masterpiece, but in the chaos of that afternoon, the terrifying weakness of the parliamentary cause was laid bare. The Royalist Cavalry, led by the king's nephew, Prince Rupert, didn't just defeat their opponents, they swept them from the field. Rupert's troopers were gentlemen of honor. They rode fine hunters, they wore expensive armor, and they possessed a reckless, arrogant courage. When they charged, they thundered forward with a ferocity that shattered the nerve of the parliamentarian horsemen. The parliamentary left wing didn't even wait for the impact. They fired their pistols into the ground and fled in a panic, riding over their own infantry in a desperate bid to escape the Cavalier swords. Amidst this carnage, watching his own side crumble, sat Captain Oliver Cromwell. He had arrived late to the battle, bringing his small troop of 60 horsemen to the field as the fighting was already underway. He saw the panic. He saw the men throwing down their weapons. He saw the hollow squares of infantry desperately fending off cavalry with pikes, shivering in the cold, terrified and leaderless. Most importantly, he saw who these men were. In the aftermath of the battle, as the surgeons soared through shattered bone by torchlight and the freezing night air filled with the groans of the dying, Cromwell had a conversation with his cousin, the legendary parliamentarian John Hampden. This conversation is one of the most pivotal moments in British military history. It was the moment the amateur realized that the old world could not be defeated by the old rules. Cromwell looked at the broken remnants of their army, the deserters, the drunkards, the men huddled by the fires complaining of their pay, and he spoke the hard truth. "Your troops," he told Hampden, "are most of them old decayed serving men and tapsters and such kind of fellows, and their troops are gentlemen's sons, younger sons and persons of quality." He was diagnosing a spiritual sickness. The Royalists were fighting for something they believed in, the king, their honor, their birthright. The Parliamentarians were fighting because they had been conscripted or because they needed a shilling. A tapster, a man who pours ale in a pub, does not stand and fight when 1,000 pounds of horseflesh and steel is thundering towards him. He runs. "Do you think," Cromwell asked, "that the spirits of such base and mean fellows will ever be able to encounter gentlemen that have honor and courage and resolution in them?" Hampden, a wise and political man, nodded politely but thought the idea was impractical. How do you change the nature of the common man? But Cromwell was already formulating the answer. "You must get men of a spirit," Cromwell declared, his voice rising with that strange, prophetic intensity, "and take it not ill what I say, I know you will not, of a spirit that is likely to go on as far as gentlemen will go, or else you will be beaten still." Men of a spirit, it was a revolutionary concept. Cromwell realized that he could not match the Royalists in breeding. He could not recruit more dukes or earls because most of them were with the king, so he would have to find a substitute for honor. And for Oliver Cromwell, there was only one force in the universe more powerful than the code of the aristocracy, the fear of God. He left the main army and returned to the Eastern Association. The counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Cambridge and Hertfordshire determined to build a new kind of regiment from the ground up. He would not recruit the dregs of society. He would not take the unemployed or the criminals that other captains pressed into service to fill their quotas. He looked for the plain men. He looked for the sons of freeholders, the men who spent their Sundays listening to radical preachers, the men who read their Bibles by candlelight and worried about the salvation of their souls. These were men who believed, as Cromwell did, that this war was not about taxes or ship money. It was about the Antichrist. It was a war against spiritual darkness. He began to recruit them, and more importantly, he began to respect them. In a letter that would shock the rigid class hierarchy of England, he wrote, "I had rather have a plain, russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else." Think about the weight of that statement. In 1643, you did not make a man a captain because he knew what he fought for. You made him a captain because his father owned land. Cromwell was tearing up the social contract. He was telling his men that their conviction mattered more than their pedigree. He was telling them that a God-fearing ploughman was superior to a godless prince. He took these religious zealots and he gave them something the decayed serving men never had: purpose. But purpose alone is not enough to stop a cavalry charge. You need iron discipline. And so the farmer-turned-soldier began to drill his new recruits with a relentless, obsessive focus. He taught them to care for their horses before themselves. He taught them to charge neatly, a solid wall of horseflesh that hit with the impact of a hammer. He forbade swearing. He forbade plunder. A man in Cromwell's troop found caught stealing a chicken from a peasant would be whipped. A man found drunk would be cast out. The rest of the parliamentary army laughed at them. They called them holy brothers and mocked their psalm singing and their somber faces. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like a prayer meeting on horseback. But while the critics sneered, Cromwell was forging a weapon. He was taking the base and mean fellows and transmuting them, through the alchemy of faith and discipline, into the most terrifying killing machine Europe had ever seen. The serving men were gone. The Ironsides were coming. In the damp, flat fields of Cambridge and Huntingdon, away from the grand manoeuvring of the main armies, Oliver Cromwell began to build a machine. It is a mistake to think of the Ironsides merely as religious zealots, as if their faith alone made them invincible. Faith was the fuel, certainly, but the engine was drill. Relentless, exhausting, repetitive drill. Cromwell, the man with no military education, had intuitively grasped the single greatest weakness of 17th-century cavalry warfare. In this era, a cavalry charge was a one-shot weapon. The horsemen would gather speed, thunder into the enemy lines, fire their pistols, and hack with their swords. If they broke the enemy, the victors would almost immediately lose all cohesion. Filled with adrenaline and greed, they would scatter, chasing fleeing prisoners for ransom or galloping to the rear to loot the enemy's baggage train. A commander could launch a charge, but he could not recall it. Prince Rupert, the king's nephew, was the master of this thunderbolt style, terrifying on impact, but useless 5 minutes later. Cromwell wanted something different. He did not want a thunderbolt. He wanted a hammer that could strike, pull back, and strike again. He trained his men to charge at a good round trot, neatly, a moving wall of horseflesh that relied on the sheer weight of impact rather than wild speed. But the true genius lay in what happened after the collision. While the Royalists were scattering to hunt for silver plates and wine in the baggage wagons, Cromwell's men were drilled to halt. Amidst the screaming, the smoke, and the chaos of melee, they were trained to listen for the trumpet, pull their horses around, and reform their lines. They were the only cavalry in England that could charge, break an enemy, regroup, and then charge a second target. To achieve this, he imposed a discipline that was alien to the age. In the Royalist camps, war was a grand adventure, accompanied by drinking, gambling, and a caravan of camp followers. In Cromwell's camp, the atmosphere was that of a monastery on the march. A contemporary observer noted the eerie silence of his troops. No brawling, no swearing, no dice rolling. The punishment for plunder was death. The punishment for swearing was a fine. But this discipline wasn't maintained solely by the whip. It was maintained by justice. Cromwell ensured his men were paid. In a war where soldiers often went months without wages, resorting to stealing from the peasantry to survive, Cromwell's russet-coated captains paid for their bread and cheese. This forged a bond of trust between the leader and the led that the king's generals could never replicate. Cromwell looked after his men's horses before his own comfort, earning him the nickname Old Noel. He was demanding, severe, and terrifying, but he was fair. By 1644, this experiment in the Eastern Association had caught the attention of the enemy. It was Prince Rupert himself, the darling of the Cavalier set, who first gave them their immortal name. After a skirmish where the Parliamentarian lines refused to break under pressure, Rupert referred to Cromwell as Old Ironsides. He meant it as a grudging compliment to the man's stubbornness, but the name stuck to the troops. They were men of iron, inflexible, hard, and unbreakable. However, Cromwell faced a problem that drill could not solve. The war was dragging on. It was now a stalemate, bleeding the country dry. The issue lay at the very top. The main parliamentary armies were commanded by great aristocrats, the Earl of Essex and the Earl of Manchester. These men were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. They were terrified of actually winning. They feared that if they crushed the king too completely, the social order would collapse and the common people would rise up. They wanted a draw, a negotiated peace where the king remained on the throne but with clipped wings. Cromwell, the radical, saw this hesitation as a betrayal of God. He realized that the old, decaying serving men were not just in the ranks, they were in the high command. In late 1644, Cromwell returned to Parliament and dropped a political bombshell. He stood up and accused his own superior officer, the Earl of Manchester, of incompetence and a lack of will to fight. The debate that followed shook the foundations of the cause. Cromwell argued that the war would never end unless the army was completely divorced from politics. As long as lords and members of Parliament held the command, they would fight to preserve their own status, not to secure victory. "If we beat the king 99 times," Cromwell famously argued, "he is king still, and so will his posterity be after him. But if the king beat us once, we shall all be hanged, and our posterity be made slaves." He proposed a radical solution, the self-denying ordinance. This law stipulated that no member of the House of Commons or the House of Lords could hold a commission in the army. The aristocrats would have to resign their commands. The politicians would have to stay in Westminster. The army would be professionalized, commanded by soldiers, not by birthright. It was a masterstroke. It swept away the old, hesitant leadership of Essex and Manchester. In their place rose the new model army. This was the first national, professional army in British history. It was clothed in red coats, the first time the iconic British uniform was standardized, and it was organized strictly on merit. And then a curious thing happened. A deliberate exception was made. Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed Lord General of this new army, a brilliant professional soldier. But when the time came for Oliver Cromwell to resign his commission in accordance with the very law he had proposed, Parliament hesitated. The campaign season was starting. The enemy was on the move. They looked at the new model army, 22,000 men, perfectly organized, but lacking a lieutenant general of the horse. They looked at the terrifying effectiveness of the Ironsides. And they realized they could not afford to lose him. A special dispensation was granted. Oliver Cromwell would be the only member of Parliament allowed to remain in the army. It was the moment the door locked behind him. The safeguards were removed. The aristocratic buffers were gone. The new model army was now a reality, a force of 22,000 men, clad in red, paid by the state, drilled to perfection, and burning with religious fire. At its head rode Fairfax, the calm professional, and at his right hand rode Cromwell, the visionary amateur who had forged the cavalry into a thunderbolt of God. The king, sitting in Oxford, laughed when he heard the news. He called the new model army the New Noddle Army. He joked that it was commanded by Skippon the Brute and Noel the fanatical farmer. He believed that an army without aristocrats would collapse at the first sign of pressure. He believed that blood and breeding were the only things that mattered in war. He was wrong. The time for skirmishes and stalemates was over. The machine was built. The engine was running. And in the summer heat of 1644, on a moor outside of York, the king's laughter would die in his throat. The star was about to rise. The date was July the 2nd, 1644. The place was a stretch of wild, open heathland just outside the ancient city of York, known as Marston Moor. It was here, amidst the tall rye and the summer heat, that the amateur captain finally met the professional prince. This was the largest gathering of soldiers on English soil since the Wars of the Roses. On one side stood the allied armies of Parliament and the Scottish Covenanters, a massive host of 28,000 men. On the other stood the king's forces, 18,000 strong, commanded by the man who had become a living nightmare for the parliamentary cause, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. We must pause to understand the aura that surrounded Prince Rupert. He was 23 years old, the king's nephew, and possessed of a terrifying, almost supernatural reputation. In the eyes of the parliamentarian propaganda press, he was not just a general, he was a warlock. They claimed he was shot-proof, that he could catch bullets in his hands. He rode into battle with a large white poodle named Boy, which the Puritans genuinely believed was a familiar spirit, a demon in the shape of a dog. Rupert was the embodiment of the Cavalier ideal, reckless, arrogant, and hitherto undefeated. He had relieved the siege of York with a brilliant maneuver that left the Allied generals looking foolish. He was the master of the field. On the afternoon of July 2nd, Rupert felt invincible. He drew up his army across the moor, separated from the enemy by a ditch and a hedge. But as the day wore on, a strange paralysis settled over the field. The two great hosts simply stared at one another. It was a hot, humid day, the air thick with the threat of thunder. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the conventional wisdom of 17th-century warfare dictated that it was too late to start a battle. Fighting in the dark was a recipe for chaos. Prince Rupert, confident that the Allies would not dare attack him, gave the order for his men to stand down. "We will fight them in the morning," he declared. He dismounted, took off his helmet, and sat down to eat his supper. The Royalist infantry grounded their pikes and began to cook their rations. Smoke from hundreds of campfires drifted lazily into the evening air. It was the single greatest mistake of the war. On the ridge opposite, Oliver Cromwell and the Allied commanders were watching. They saw the smoke. They saw the ranks relax. And then, as if on cue, the heavens opened. A massive summer thunderstorm broke over the moor, hail and rain lashing down, turning the sky a bruised purple. Amidst the crack of thunder, the Allied order was given: advance. It was a scene of absolute catastrophe for the Royalists. Men scrambled to find their helmets, kicking over cooking pots, grabbing muskets that were wet with rain. The Parliamentarian army rolled down the slope like a slow tide of steel. Cromwell was commanding the cavalry on the left wing. He had roughly 4,000 horsemen, his Ironsides, and the disciplined Scottish cavalry under David Leslie. Facing him, on the Royalist right, was Lord Byron, not Rupert. Rupert was in the rear, eating his dinner. Lord Byron, seeing Cromwell advancing, made a fatal error. Instead of holding his ground behind the ditch and using his musketeers to break up the charge, he panicked. He ordered his men to charge forward to meet Cromwell. This forfeited his defensive advantage and disordered his own lines. The collision was horrific. Cromwell's troopers, singing psalms that were swallowed by the roar of the storm, slammed into the Royalist horse. It was a grinding, hacking melee. At one point, Cromwell himself was wounded in the neck, temporarily blinded by the flash of a pistol. For a moment, the parliamentarian wing wavered. It looked as if they might break, but the discipline held. David Leslie's Scottish lancers plunged into the flank of the Royalists, relieving the pressure. Then Prince Rupert arrived. He had thrown down his supper, leaped onto his horse, and galloped to the point of crisis. His mere presence usually rallied the men. He rallied his own reserves and smashed into Cromwell's troopers. It was the moment the war had been waiting for, the Ironsides versus Rupert's elite. The fighting was desperate, sword against sword in the driving rain. But slowly, inexorably, the godly discipline prevailed. The Royalist cavalry, disordered by their own aggression, began to crumble. They broke, they fled. This is where the battle and the war was won. In a typical engagement, this would be the end of the cavalry's role. The victorious horsemen would gallop off the map, chasing the fleeing enemy for miles, hacking at their backs, looting their baggage. This is exactly what happened on the other side of the battlefield. The Royalist Lord Goring had smashed the Parliamentarian right wing, and his men had disappeared into the night, chasing plunder, leaving the battle effectively over for them. But Cromwell did not chase. In the midst of the adrenaline, the screaming, and the thunder, Cromwell and Leslie halted their men. They blew the trumpets. They reined in their chargers. It was a miracle of command and control. The Ironsides stopped, reformed their lines, and wheeled around. They were now behind the Royalist army. Cromwell looked across the chaotic field. He saw that in the centre, the Parliamentarian infantry were being slaughtered by the Royalist foot. He saw the battle was on a knife edge, and so he did the unthinkable. He led his cavalry in a sweep right across the rear of the enemy army, smashing into the unprotected backs of the Royalist infantry. It was a massacre. The Royalist foot soldiers, engaged to their front, suddenly heard the thunder of hooves behind them. They were trapped in a vice of bone and steel. Final stand was made by the Marquis of Newcastle's own regiment, the Whitecoats, so named for their undyed woolen uniforms. They were proud northern men who had sworn never to yield, and they kept their promise. Surrounded by Cromwell's troopers, offered quarter, they refused to surrender. They stood in their square, pikes levelled, fighting until they were cut down where they stood. When the moon finally broke through the storm clouds, the Whitecoats lay in their ranks as if on parade, their white uniforms turned red. The defeat was total. Prince Rupert, the invincible warlock, was forced to hide in a bean field to escape capture. His army was annihilated. 4,000 Royalists lay dead. The north of England, the king's greatest stronghold, was lost forever. In the silence of the aftermath, the psychological landscape of the war shifted. The myth of Cavalier superiority was dead. The Royalist gentry, who believed they were born to rule and born to fight, had been broken by a mesmerizing combination of religious zeal and professional drill. Cromwell, writing to his brother-in-law after the battle, did not boast of his tactics. He did not mention the flank attack or the discipline. He gave all the glory to the providence he served. Truly, he wrote, England and the Church of God hath had a great favour from the Lord. It had all the evidence of an absolute victory obtained by the Lord's blessing upon the godly party. God made them as stubble to our swords. The star had risen. The Fenland farmer was no longer a backbench MP or a local captain. He was the architect of the king's destruction. And as the news of Marston Moor spread south to London, the politicians in Westminster began to realise that they had created something they might not be able to control. They had wanted a general who could fight. They had found a force of nature. If Marston Moor was the awakening, Naseby was the execution. By June 1645, the civil war had dragged on for 3 bloody, indecisive years. The kingdom was exhausted. The fields were trampled, the trade routes were severed, and the people were sick of soldiers. But in the Royalist camp, spirits were confusingly high. King Charles, a man who possessed a unique talent for self-delusion, looked at his enemies and saw only weakness. He knew the Parliamentarians had spent the winter arguing amongst themselves. He knew they had fired their aristocratic generals. He looked at their new creation, the new model army, and he sneered. To the king, this new army was a joke. It was a collection of religious fanatics commanded by a mad country gentleman, Sir Thomas Fairfax, and his deputy, the brewer Cromwell. The king christened it the New Nodal Army. He believed that without the highborn earls to lead them, these commoners would scatter at the first sight of a prince's banner. On the eve of the battle, the king was so confident of victory that he went hunting. He chased a stag through the Northamptonshire woods, utterly oblivious to the fact that he was the one being hunted. The two armies met on the morning of June the 14th, on a high plateau of land known as the Broad Moor. It was a misty morning, the kind of damp English summer dawn that chills the bone. As the fog lifted, the Royalists looked across the valley and saw something new. They did not see the mismatched, colourful coats of the county militias they were used to fighting. They saw a long, solid wall of red. This was the debut of the redcoat, the uniform that would one day conquer the globe. But on this morning, it was untested, raw, and waiting to be broken. The battle began with a sense of déjà vu. Once again, Prince Rupert, commanding the Royalist right wing, decided to win the war in a single stroke. He launched his cavalry against the Parliamentarian left, commanded by Henry Ireton. The impact was devastating. Rupert's men, the cream of the Cavalier gentry, smashed through Ireton's ranks like a cannonball through a stained glass window. Ireton was wounded, his horse was shot from under him, and he was taken prisoner. The Parliamentarian left wing simply ceased to exist. True to form, Rupert's men cheered, spurred their horses, and galloped off the map. They chased the fleeing survivors all the way to the baggage train in the rear, where they stopped to demand liquor and loot the wagons. For the second time in the war, Rupert had won his personal duel but abandoned his army. In the centre, the situation was grim. The Royalist infantry, veterans of hard campaigns, slammed into the new model infantry. These were the raw recruits, the conscripts who had been dragged from their homes only months before. Under the terrifying pressure of the Royalist pike push, the redcoats began to waver. Their lines bent. Their commander, Philip Skippon, was shot in the stomach, but refused to leave the field, shouting, "I will not go so long as a man will stand." It was a moment of supreme crisis. To any observer, it looked like the new Nodal army was about to collapse, just as the king had predicted. But the king had forgotten about the right wing. He had forgotten about the Fenland farmer. On the high ground of the eastern flank, Oliver Cromwell sat on his horse, watching the disaster unfold in the centre. He faced the Royalist Northern Horse, commanded by Sir Marmaduke Langdale. The terrain was difficult, rabbit holes and furze bushes, but Cromwell did not hesitate. At the critical moment, he raised his sword and gave the order. The Ironsides rolled forward. This was not the wild, screaming charge of Prince Rupert. It was a machine. They hit Langdale's cavalry with the force of a hydraulic press. The Royalists, tired and demoralized, shattered on impact. Now came the test of the new model. By all the laws of adrenaline and warfare, Cromwell's men should have chased the fleeing Northern Horse. They should have scattered, but they didn't. In a display of discipline that must have seemed almost inhuman to the watching king, the Ironsides halted. Cromwell detached a small force to keep the enemy running, and then, with a series of trumpet blasts, he wheeled his main force around. He looked down into the dusty pit of the centre, where the Royalist infantry were grinding the Parliamentarian foot soldiers into the dirt. He saw the exposed flank of the king's army. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. Cromwell smashed into the side of the Royalist infantry. At the same moment, the battered Parliamentarian foot soldiers, seeing their saviour arrive, found a second wind and surged forward. The king's infantry were caught in a vice. King Charles, watching from the reserve, saw his army disintegrating. For a moment, the mask of the divine monarch slipped, and the desperate man appeared. He drew his sword and prepared to charge into the melee, a final, suicidal gesture of honour. "One charge more, gentlemen," he cried, "and we recover the day." But it was too late for honour. A Scottish courtier, the Earl of Carnwath, grabbed the king's bridle. "Will you go upon your death in an instant?" he shouted, and physically pulled the king's horse away from the fighting. The king turned and fled. The Royalist army did not just lose, it was erased. The infantry surrendered in their thousands. The artillery was captured. The baggage train was taken, but the greatest prize of Naseby was not a cannon or a flag. It was a small, ornate cabinet, velvet-lined and locked, found in the king's abandoned carriage. When Cromwell and Fairfax opened this cabinet, they found the king's private correspondence, and what they read destroyed Charles Stuart more completely than any cannonball could. The letters revealed that the king, who had publicly sworn he was fighting to defend the Protestant Church of England, was secretly negotiating with the Pope. He was trying to bring in Catholic soldiers from Ireland. He was begging the French to invade his own country. He was promising to suspend laws against Catholics in exchange for foreign bayonets to kill his own people. Parliament published these letters immediately. They were titled, "The King's Cabinet Opened." It was a masterstroke of propaganda. Until this moment, many had fought the king with a heavy heart, believing him to be a misguided but honourable sovereign. Now, they saw him as a traitor to his own nation. The psychological bond between the monarch and his people was severed. Naseby was the end of the war, though the fighting would sputter on for another year. The new Nodal army had destroyed the veteran forces of the crown in less than 3 hours. They had proven that a tailor could fight better than a lord, provided he had the right discipline and the right cause. As the sun set over the broad moor, lighting up the carnage of 5,000 dead and wounded, Oliver Cromwell sat down to write his report to the Speaker of the House of Commons. He was exhausted, his face blackened with powder smoke, but his hand was steady. He did not ask for rewards. He did not ask for titles. He simply stated the terrifying truth of the New World Order. Sir, this is none other but the hand of God, and to him alone belongs the glory. Honest men served you faithfully in this action. Sir, they are trusty. I beseech you, in the name of God, not to discourage them. The honest men, the plain russet-coated captains, had inherited the earth. The king was a fugitive. The aristocrats were beaten. The farmer had won. But as the dust settled, a new and darker question began to form. The war was won, but the peace was yet to be fought. And the man who had just destroyed the king's army was about to find that destroying a king's soul is a much bloodier business. The war was supposed to be over. The king was dead, his head severed from his shoulders in an act of terrifying finality. The monarchy was abolished. The House of Lords was dissolved. England was now a commonwealth, a republic built on the ideals of the Bible and the bayonet. But peace is often harder to win than war. And as the summer of 1649 bled into autumn, Oliver Cromwell found himself looking across the Irish Sea toward a gathering storm that threatened to wash his fragile new republic into the ocean. To the English Parliament, Ireland was not merely a rebellious colony, it was a nightmare. It was a land where the enemies of the state, Catholic Confederates and Protestant Royalists, had joined forces in a rare and dangerous alliance. They had crowned the dead king's son, Charles II, and were preparing a fleet to invade England. If Cromwell did not strike them, they would strike him. But to understand the horror that was about to unfold, we must understand the baggage Cromwell carried with him on the ship. He was not just a general embarking on a campaign. He was a man possessed by a cold, furious, theological rage. For 8 years, the English press had been filled with lurid, exaggerated tales of the Irish Rebellion of 1641, stories of innocent Protestant settlers being butchered, stripped naked, and driven into the snow by Catholic insurgents. To Cromwell, the Irish were not honourable opponents like the Cavaliers at Naseby. They were blood-guilty. They were savages who had shed the blood of the saints. He was not going to Ireland to conquer, he was going to judge. He landed in Dublin in August 1649 with a fleet of 35 ships and an army of 12,000 battle-hardened veterans. These were the men of the new model army, the victors of Marston Moor and Naseby, disciplined, well-paid, and utterly convinced of their own righteousness. They marched north, hugging the coast, toward the fortified port town of Drogheda. Drogheda was a formidable obstacle, surrounded by massive medieval walls and defended by a garrison of 3,000 seasoned troops under the command of Sir Arthur Aston, a Catholic royalist who had fought for the king in England. Aston was a hard man, a veteran of the European wars, recognizable by his wooden leg, a souvenir from a previous battle. He looked at Cromwell's approaching army and felt confident. He who could take Drogheda, Aston boasted, could take hell. On September the 10th, the parliamentary cannons began to roar. For a day and a night, the heavy siege guns battered the southeast corner of the town walls, specifically the steeple of St. Mary's Church, which dominated the defences. The stone crumbled. The breaches were made. Then, according to the strict laws of 17th-century warfare, Cromwell issued a summons. He offered the garrison a choice: surrender now and your lives will be spared. Refuse, and if the walls are stormed, you will be entitled to no quarter. This was the brutal mathematics of siege warfare. If a defender forced the attacker to spend blood scaling the walls, the attacker was legally permitted to slaughter the defenders as punishment. It was a rule designed to encourage quick surrenders. Sir Arthur Aston refused. He believed the walls would hold. He believed the winter would break Cromwell's army. He was wrong. At 5 o'clock in the evening on September the 11th, the redcoats surged forward. The initial assault was ferocious. The Royalist defenders fought with desperate courage, firing from the rubble, driving the first wave of Cromwell's men back in confusion. For a moment, it seemed the attack had failed. But then, the 50-year-old Lord General, Oliver Cromwell himself, did something he rarely did. He dismounted, drew his sword, and physically led the second wave into the breach. Seeing their commander in the kill zone, the Ironsides rallied. They flooded over the walls like a rising tide of iron. The defense collapsed, and then the darkness descended. Cromwell, flushed with the adrenaline of battle and the memory of the 1641 massacres, issued the order that would stain his soul forever. In the heat of action, he commanded, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town. What followed was not war, it was slaughter. The Parliamentarian soldiers moved through the streets of Drogheda like a scythe. Royalist officers who surrendered were knocked on the head. Soldiers throwing down their muskets were run through with pikes. Sir Arthur Aston, the governor, was cornered. The soldiers, believing his wooden leg might be hollow and filled with gold coins, beat him to death with it. The horror reached its peak at St. Peter's Church, located on the high ground of the town. The surviving defenders, along with some Catholic priests, had barricaded themselves inside the steeple. When they refused to come out, Cromwell ordered the pews to be stacked beneath the tower and set alight. The steeple became a chimney. As the flames roared upward, the screams of the men burning alive echoed over the city. One man was heard to leap from the top of the tower to escape the fire, only to break his legs on the ground and be finished off by the troopers below. By the time the sun rose the next morning, over 3,000 people lay dead in the streets of Drogheda. The garrison had been exterminated. The controversy over whether civilians were indiscriminately killed rages to this day, but what is certain is that the mercy shown at Naseby was absent here. Cromwell, in his letter to Parliament, did not hide from the carnage. He justified it. "I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, who have dipped their hands in so much innocent blood." He believed that this terrible example would save lives in the long run by terrifying other towns into immediate surrender. And militarily, he was right. When he marched south to Wexford a month later, the panic that preceded him was palpable. Wexford, however, was even more chaotic. While negotiations for surrender were actually taking place, the nervous captain of the castle suddenly yielded the keys to the English. The new model army, seeing the gates open, didn't wait for orders. They poured into the town. The result was another frenzy of uncontrolled violence. The town was sacked, the harbour was destroyed, and hundreds more were put to the sword. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in logistics and speed. Cromwell broke the back of the Irish resistance in 9 months. He smashed the alliance of Royalists and Confederates. He confiscated millions of acres of land, transplanting the native Catholic landowners to the harsh, rocky province of Connaught with the infamous phrase, "to hell or to Connaught." But the victory came at a terrible price. In England, Cromwell was the hero who had asserted the power of the new republic. In Ireland, he became the devil incarnate. The curse of Cromwell became a malediction that would last for centuries. The massacre at Drogheda tore a wound in the history of the British Isles that has never fully healed. It transformed the political struggle of the Civil War into an ethnic and religious vendetta that would haunt future generations. Cromwell left Ireland in May 1650, never to return. He left behind a conquered island and a shattered people. He believed he had done God's work. He believed he had brought justice to the barbarous wretches. But as he sailed back across the Irish Sea, watching the coastline fade into the mist, he was sailing toward a new crisis. The young Charles II had not given up. He had simply moved his court. While Cromwell had been wading through blood in Ireland, the prince had travelled to Scotland. The Scots, the very people who had started the war against the king's father, had now declared for the son. The hero of the Commonwealth had crushed the Irish, but now he faced a heartbreak. He would have to draw his sword against his former allies, his brothers in the Protestant faith. The stain of blood was drying on his boots, but the miracle of Dunbar was waiting in the fog of the north. The war had changed. It was no longer a crusade against a tyrant king, nor a brutal suppression of a rebellious colony. It had become a fratricide. In the summer of 1650, Oliver Cromwell marched the new model army across the border into Scotland, invading the land of his former allies. These were the men who had fought beside him at Marston Moor. They were fellow Protestants, fellow Covenanters, men who read the same Bible and sang the same psalms. But they had committed the one sin Cromwell could not forgive. They had crowned the son of the man he had executed. They had anointed Charles II as king, believing they could control him, believing they could use the monarchy to enforce their Presbyterian religion upon the whole of Britain. Cromwell pleaded with them. In one of the most famous letters of his life, he wrote to the General Assembly of the Kirk of Scotland, begging them to reconsider their alliance with the House of Stuart. "I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ," he wrote, "think it possible you may be mistaken." But the Scots were not mistaken. They were mobilized, and they were led by David Leslie, a general of immense skill who knew exactly how Cromwell fought. Leslie had no intention of meeting the Ironsides in an open field. He knew that in a pitched battle, the new model army was invincible, so he chose to starve them. Leslie enacted a scorched earth policy. He stripped the land from the border to Edinburgh, burning crops and driving away livestock. He forced Cromwell to rely on supply ships from England, which were at the mercy of the weather. For a month, the two armies danced a grim waltz. Cromwell marched and maneuvered, trying to tempt Leslie into a fight. Leslie simply sat behind his fortified lines, watching the English army rot. And rot they did. The summer of 1650 was one of the wettest in living memory. The English soldiers, soaked to the skin, sleeping in mud, began to die of dysentery and fever, a sickness they called the country disease. By the end of August, Cromwell's force of 16,000 had withered to barely 11,000 fit men. They were hungry, demoralized, and far from home. Recognizing that the campaign was failing, Cromwell ordered a retreat. He fell back to the small port town of Dunbar, hoping to evacuate his sick soldiers by sea. But when he arrived, he found the trap had snapped shut. On the 1st of September, 1650, the situation was apocalyptic. Cromwell's army was huddled on the low ground near the coast. To their backs was the restless, grey North Sea. To their front, blocking the road back to England, was the massive bulk of Doon Hill. And sitting atop that hill, looking down like vultures, was the Scottish army. The numbers were terrifying. David Leslie had 23,000 men, fresh, well-fed, and holding the ultimate high ground. Cromwell had fewer than 11,000, many of whom were so sick they could barely hold a pike. The English were hemmed in. They had no room to maneuver, no way to escape, and no hope of reinforcement. Cromwell, writing to the governor of Newcastle that night, sounded like a man preparing for the end. "We are upon an engagement very difficult," he admitted. "The enemy hath blocked up our way, and our lying here daily consumeth our men who fall sick beyond imagination." He described himself as poor, shattered, and contemptible. It should have been the end. By all the logic of warfare, the next morning would see the Scots roll down the hill and push the English into the sea. It would be a massacre. But then, the miracle happened. On the afternoon of September the 2nd, through his telescope, Cromwell saw movement on the hill. The Scots were abandoning the high ground. Why they did this remains one of the great debates of history. Some say the radical Presbyterian ministers who accompanied the Scottish army grew impatient. They believed God had already delivered the sectarian English into their hands and demanded that Leslie go down and finish them off. Others say it was a tactical decision. The weather on the hill was atrocious, and Leslie wanted to move closer to the English to prevent them from slipping away in the night. Whatever the reason, it was a fatal error. The Scots began to descend the slope, cramming their massive army into a narrow strip of land between the foot of the hill and a steep ravine known as the Broxburn. Cromwell was walking in the garden of Broxmouth House with his Major General, John Lambert, when he saw it. He saw the Scottish left wing bunching up. He saw that they had surrendered their advantage. The gloom of the previous days vanished instantly. The melancholia was replaced by that terrifying, electric clarity that always seized him before a battle. He turned to Lambert and said simply, "God is delivering them into our hands." He realized that he didn't have to wait to be attacked. If he struck first, if he could move his army across the ravine in the dead of night and smash into the Scottish right flank before they were ready, he could roll up their entire line. It was a gamble of insane proportions. He was attacking an army twice his size, uphill, across a brook. The night of September the 2nd was miserable. A howling wind blew rain horizontally across the fields, extinguishing the matches of the musketeers and masking the sound of the English movement. Under the cover of this storm, the new model army performed a feat of discipline that no other force in Europe could have matched. In total darkness, they redeployed. They moved their artillery, their cavalry, and their infantry into position along the edge of the ravine. The soldiers huddled in the cornfields, soaked and shivering, waiting for the dawn. At 4:00 a.m., the moon broke through the clouds. The order was given. The English vanguard, led by the cavalry, splashed across the Broxburn. The Scottish sentries, startled by the sudden appearance of redcoats in the gloom, fired their muskets, but it was too late to raise the alarm. The English were upon them. The battle was not an immediate walkover. The Scots were tough. Their infantry regiments, particularly the Highlanders, stood their ground with pikes levelled. For an hour the two armies were locked in a push of pike, a brutal chest-to-chest shoving match where the front ranks were crushed by the weight of the men behind them. The English cavalry charged, were repulsed, and charged again. The air was filled with the smoke of black powder and the roar of scripture. The Scots shouted, "The Covenant, the Covenant." The English roared back, "The Lord of Hosts." Cromwell arrived with the reserves at the critical moment. He directed his own regiment of horse to flank the Scottish infantry. The sheer weight of the Ironsides, hitting the Scots from the side while the infantry pinned them from the front, was the breaking point. And then the sun came up. As the first rays of light spilled over the North Sea, illuminating the battlefield, the Scottish line buckled. Cromwell, seeing the enemy waver, shouted over the din of battle, a quote from Psalm 68, "Let God arise, and let his enemies be scattered." It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a rout. The Scottish right wing collapsed into their centre, causing chaos. The English cavalry cut through them like a scythe through ripe corn. The Scottish army, trapped by the very geography that was supposed to help them, had nowhere to run. They were bottled up between the hill and the ravine. In the space of 1 hour, the finest army Scotland could field was annihilated. 3,000 Scots were killed in the initial clash and the subsequent chase, which stretched for 8 miles. 10,000 were taken prisoner, almost the entire surviving force. Cromwell captured all their artillery, all their baggage, and 200 colours, flags. The English losses? It sounds like propaganda, but the records are consistent. Cromwell lost fewer than 30 men killed. The miracle of Dunbar was complete. From the depths of despair, from a position where surrender seemed the only logical option, Cromwell had achieved the greatest victory of his career. He sat down on a drumhead on the field, amidst the wreckage of the Scottish army, and wrote a letter to Parliament that struggled to contain his awe. He did not claim tactical genius. He did not claim credit for the night march. To him, this was the ultimate proof that God was on his side. The odds had been impossible. Therefore, the victory must be divine. This victory shattered the political will of Scotland. It left Edinburgh defenceless, allowing Cromwell to march in and occupy the capital. But more importantly, it cemented Cromwell's legend. He was no longer just a successful general. He was now viewed by his men, and by much of Europe, as an unstoppable force of nature, a man who could bend the very laws of probability to his will. But as the thousands of Scottish prisoners were marched south, many to die of starvation or be transporting as indentured servants to the colonies, the tragedy of the event lingered. This was not a victory over a foreign enemy. It was the destruction of a brother nation. Cromwell had saved the English Republic, but he had done so by breaking the back of the only other people in the world who shared his faith. The crowning mercy, as he called it, was absolute. The king had no army left. The path to total power was now wide open, and Oliver Cromwell, the farmer who had once inspected sheep in the Fens, was now the undisputed master of the British Isles. The year was 1651. The miracle of Dunbar had saved the English Republic, but it had not ended the war. The snake had been wounded, but its head remained intact. Charles Stuart, the young pretender to the throne, was desperate. He was trapped in Scotland, his army shattered, his allies bickering, and the terrifying figure of Oliver Cromwell slowly tightening the noose around him. In this atmosphere of impending doom, the future king made a decision of reckless bravery. He decided to gamble everything on one final throw of the dice. Instead of waiting to be crushed in Scotland, he would invade England. It was a strategy born of delusion. Charles believed that as soon as he crossed the border, the English people, weary of taxes, weary of Puritan rule, and sentimental for the old days, would rise up in their thousands to join him. He believed that the mere sight of the royal standard would turn the tide. So in August, he slipped past Cromwell's army and marched south, leading a ragged force of 16,000 Scots into the heart of England. It was a ghost march. As Charles moved through Lancashire and the Midlands, the uprising he fantasized about never happened. The English gentry stayed in their manor houses. The towns closed their gates. The people were tired of war, and more importantly, they were terrified of the Scots. Charles arrived in the loyal city of Worcester not as a liberator, but as a cornered fox seeking a hole. Trailing behind him, shadowing his every move, was Oliver Cromwell, but this was not the Cromwell of Edgehill, the angry captain leading a single troop. This was Cromwell, the grand strategist. He had not rushed to intercept Charles. He had deliberately let the king march south, knowing that the further Charles went, the further he was from his supply lines, and the deeper he was wandering into the trap. By the time Charles fortified himself inside the walls of Worcester, Cromwell had gathered a massive force. He called up the county militias, the very men Charles hoped would join him, and they flocked to the Parliamentarian banner. Cromwell arrived at Worcester with 30,000 men, outnumbering the Royalists nearly 2-1. The date was September the 3rd, 1651. To the superstitious mind of the 17th century, the date was electric. It was exactly 1 year to the day since the miracle of Dunbar. Cromwell, a man who read the tea leaves of Providence in every sunrise, took this as a sign. God had arranged the anniversary. The victory was preordained. But the tactical problem was immense. Worcester sits on the River Severn, a wide, fast-flowing barrier. To destroy the Royalist army, Cromwell had to attack from both sides of the river simultaneously, cutting off any hope of escape. To do this, he needed to cross a major waterway in the face of enemy fire. It was here that the logistical genius of the new model army shined. They didn't just bring cannons, they brought boats. Great, flat-bottomed vessels hauled on wagons from miles away. Under the cover of artillery fire, Cromwell's engineers performed a miracle of combat engineering. They lashed the boats together, laying down planks to create 2 massive pontoon bridges, one across the River Teme and one across the Severn itself. The battle began in the afternoon. It was a chaotic, amphibious assault. Cromwell, now 52 years old, was the first man across the bridge of boats. He led his lifeguard regiment onto the western bank, hat in hand, urging his men forward into the hedgerows. The fighting was savage. The Scots, knowing they had nowhere to run, fought with the fury of trapped animals. They used the hedges and ditches of the English countryside as natural fortifications. For hours, the battle seesawed back and forth. This was not the open field maneuvering of Marston Moor. This was a brutal slog, pushing the enemy back yard by bloody yard. Then Charles II, watching from the tower of Worcester Cathedral, saw a weakness. He saw that Cromwell had committed the bulk of his best troops to the western bank of the river. The eastern side, facing the city gates, appeared vulnerable. With the desperation of a king fighting for his life, Charles led a massive sortie out of the city. He charged the Parliamentarian lines, hoping to break Cromwell's army in two. The shock of the attack was immense. The militia regiments buckled. The Royalist Cavalry began to push the Parliamentarians back. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though the gamble might pay off. But Cromwell was watching. Seeing the crisis on the eastern bank, he did something extraordinary. He turned his men around, galloped back across the bridge of boats, the very bridge he had built for this exact contingency, and slammed into the flank of the king's attack. It was the deciding moment of the entire civil war. The arrival of Cromwell and his veterans broke the Royalist momentum. The king's charge faltered, then collapsed. The retreat turned into a rout. The Parliamentarians chased the Royalists back toward the city walls. The panic was so great that the gates were jammed with fleeing men and horses. Charles himself was nearly captured, forced to dismount and scramble into the city on foot. The new model army stormed the gates. The battle spilled into the streets of Worcester. It became a house-to-house hunt. The Scots made their final stand near the town hall, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and firepower. By nightfall, the streets of Worcester were choked with the dead. The Royalist army had ceased to exist. Thousands were killed, and thousands more were taken prisoner, destined for the sugar plantations of the West Indies. Charles II managed to slip away in the confusion, beginning a famous 6-week fugitive odyssey that would see him hiding in an oak tree and disguising himself as a servant before escaping to France. But his army was gone. His cause was dead. Oliver Cromwell sat down that evening to write to the Speaker of the House. He was exhausted, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind the heavy realization that the bloodshed was finally over. He searched for the words to describe the magnitude of the victory. He did not call it a miracle this time. He called it a crowning mercy. The phrase was carefully chosen. It was a mercy because it ended the war. It was crowning because it was the final, undeniable proof of God's favor. It was the capstone of his career. The Battle of Worcester was the end of the English civil wars. The fighting that had begun 9 years earlier on the frosty ridge of Edgehill had ended in the blood-slicked streets of Worcester. The king was in exile. The Parliament was supreme. The army was the master of the land. But as the cannons cooled and the soldiers began to celebrate, a strange silence descended on Oliver Cromwell. He returned to London not just as a general, but as a conqueror. He was greeted with a hero's welcome. Parliament voted him a massive estate and a salary of £4,000 a year. He was the most powerful man in the British Isles. And therein lay the tragedy. The soldier's job was done. The enemy in the field had been destroyed. But now Cromwell faced a new enemy, one that could not be charged with cavalry or broken with a bridge of boats. He faced the chaos of peace. He faced a parliament that was corrupt, slow, and self-serving. He faced a nation that was divided, bitter, and confused. The farmer had become the general had become the legend. Now the legend had to become the ruler, and as Cromwell would soon discover, it is much easier to kill a king than it is to govern a country. The crowning mercy was over. The king, in all but name, was about to take the stage. The war was won, the king was dead. The royalist armies were scattered to the winds. By 1651, Oliver Cromwell stood at the summit of the mountain. He was the most successful general in English history, the darling of the army, and the savior of the Republic. But as he sheathed his sword and returned to the grey stone corridors of Westminster, he found that the view from the top was not one of promised land, but of a swamp. For years, Cromwell had told his soldiers they were fighting for a righteous cause, for liberty of conscience and a godly government. But the reality of the post-war Commonwealth was bitter. The Parliament that ruled England, the so-called Rump Parliament, was a corrupt, stagnant remnant of the body that had begun the war. These men were not the saints Cromwell had envisioned. They were lawyers, merchants, and career politicians who seemed far more interested in enriching themselves and clinging to power than in building Jerusalem on England's green and pleasant land. Cromwell watched them with a growing, simmering fury. He saw them dragging their feet on essential reforms. He saw them taking bribes. He saw them planning to perpetuate their own rule indefinitely. The man who had charged the pikes at Marston Moor and stormed the walls of Drogheda was not a man who possessed the virtue of patience. On April 20, 1653, the volcano finally erupted. Cromwell arrived at the House of Commons dressed in plain black clothes and grey worsted stockings. He sat in his usual seat, listening to the debate. The MPs were discussing a bill that would allow them to retain their seats without new elections. To Cromwell, this was the ultimate betrayal. It was tyranny by committee. He whispered to his neighbour, "I must do it." He stood up. At first he spoke calmly, commending the Parliament for their care of the public good. But then his tone changed. The rage of the Old Testament prophet took over. He began to list their crimes. He looked into the faces of the men he had once called colleagues and denounced them. He accused some of being whoremongers, others of being drunkards, and all of them of being corrupt and unjust men. The House exploded in outrage. Sir Peter Wentworth rose to object, calling Cromwell's language unparliamentary. Cromwell didn't care. He stepped into the centre of the floor and shouted the words that would echo down the centuries. "Come, come, I will put an end to your prating. You are no parliament. I say you are no parliament. I will put an end to your sitting." He signalled to the door. 30 musketeers from his own regiment marched into the sacred chamber of democracy. It was a military coup, plain and simple. The man who had taken up arms to protect the privileges of Parliament was now destroying it at gunpoint. He pointed to the ceremonial mace, the symbol of parliamentary authority, and sneered, "What shall we do with this bauble? Here, take it away." He drove the members out of the chamber like naughty schoolboys. He locked the doors and put the key in his pocket. That evening, a piece of graffiti appeared on the door of the House of Commons. "This house to be let, now unfurnished." The irony was crushing. Charles I had lost his head for trying to arrest 5 members of Parliament. Oliver Cromwell had just arrested the whole lot. But destroying a government is easy, building one is hard. For the next 5 years, Cromwell wrestled with the impossible task of ruling a nation that didn't want to be ruled by him. He tried various experiments, a nominated assembly of saints, the Barebones Parliament, a written constitution, but nothing worked. The nation was too divided. The Royalists hated him. The radical Republicans hated him. The Presbyterians hated him. Finally, in December 1653, the army officers presented him with a solution. They installed him as Lord Protector. He wore velvet. He moved into the royal palaces of Whitehall and Hampton Court. He was addressed as Your Highness. He signed his name Oliver P. Oliver Protector, just as the king had signed Charles R. Charles Rex. He had become the king in all but name. In fact, when Parliament later offered him the actual crown, he agonized over it for weeks before refusing. He knew that the title king would alienate his army, but the reality remained. He was a military dictator. The darkest hour of this dictatorship came in 1655. Facing royalist uprisings and assassination plots, Cromwell finally abandoned the pretense of civilian rule. He took a map of England and carved it up into military districts. Over each district, he placed a major general, a soldier with absolute authority to keep the peace and enforce moral virtue. This was the rule of the major generals, and it is remembered as one of the most oppressive periods in English social history. The soldiers were not just policing crime, they were policing sin. They closed the alehouses. They banned cockfighting, horse racing, and bear baiting. They enforced the strict observance of the Sabbath. Most infamously, they effectively banned Christmas. To the modern ear, this sounds like the act of a cartoon villain. But to Cromwell and the Puritans, Christmas was not a time of harmless joy. It was a pagan festival of drunkenness and gluttony that had no basis in the Bible. They ordered shops to remain open on December 25th. Soldiers roamed the streets of London, seizing food being prepared for Christmas feasts. It was a theological war on the culture of the common people. The result was a sullen, resentful quiet. Cromwell had brought order, yes. The roads were safe. The laws were enforced. England was feared and respected abroad as a great naval power, but the joy had been sucked out of the nation. The English people, who naturally leaned toward tradition and liberty, felt suffocated by the sword of God. Cromwell, in his private moments, seemed to understand the trap he was in. He was a man who genuinely loved liberty, yet he found himself forced to act as a tyrant to prevent chaos. He was the jailer of the nation he wanted to set free. He fought with his parliaments just as the king had done, dissolving them when they disagreed with him, shouting at them, lecturing them. He was a titan, holding the roof of the state up with his bare hands, but he was alone. His health began to fail. The sheer stress of managing the 3 kingdoms, of watching his back for assassins, of trying to decipher the will of God in a world that seemed to be rejecting him, it all took its toll. By 1658, the king in all but name was a shadow of the Ironside commander. He had saved the state, but he had failed to heal the soul of the nation. The glorious revolution of the saints had turned into a police state run by dragoons, and as the summer of 1658 approached, the people of England were not praying for the Lord Protector's long life. They were waiting, quietly, for him to die. It was a fitting end for a man of such tempestuous spirit. On the night of September 2nd, 1658, a massive storm swept across England. The winds were so violent that they tore the roofs off houses and uprooted great oak trees in the parks of London. And amidst the howling of the gale, in the palace of Whitehall, the Lord Protector lay dying. He was 59 years old, worn out by the burden of ruling a fractured nation and haunted by the malaria he had contracted on his campaigns. As the sun rose on September 3rd, his lucky day, the anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Oliver Cromwell slipped away. The storm had passed, but the vacuum it left behind was terrifying. For a brief moment, it seemed the dynasty might hold. His son, Richard Cromwell, was proclaimed Lord Protector, but Richard was a man of peace in a nation built by the sword. He had no grip on the army, and without the terrifying charisma of his father, the wolves began to circle. The regime collapsed with pathetic speed. The generals bickered, the parliament argued. and the people, exhausted by 20 years of moral policing and military rule, looked back to the past with a sudden, desperate nostalgia. They wanted a king. In May 1660, the unthinkable happened. Charles II, the black boy who had hidden in the oak tree, landed at Dover. The road to London was lined with cheering crowds. The church bells rang, the wine flowed, and the rule of the saints was washed away in a tide of royalist euphoria. The Commonwealth was dead. The king was back. But for the Royalists, the restoration of the monarchy was not enough. They needed revenge. They needed to kill the man who had killed the king. The fact that he was already dead did not matter. On January the 30th, 1661, the 12th anniversary of the execution of Charles I, London witnessed one of the most macabre spectacles in its history. The bodies of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw were dragged from their tombs in Westminster Abbey. They were hauled on sledges through the streets of London, the corpses bumping over the cobblestones, to the gallows at Tyburn. There, in front of a jeering crowd, the shrouded corpse of the Lord Protector was hoisted up and hanged in chains. It dangled there until sunset, a grim puppet show for the mob. At dusk, the body was taken down. The head was hacked off by the common hangman. The trunk was thrown into a common pit, but the head that had conceived the new model army, the head that had stared down Prince Rupert and dissolved parliaments, was dipped in tar and impaled on a 20-foot spike. It was set atop the roof of Westminster Hall. For more than 20 years, through rain, snow, and wind, the withered head of Oliver Cromwell looked down over the city he had ruled. It remained there long after Charles II was dead, a silent, skeletal sentinel watching the politicians come and go below. It was a final, brutal message. This is the price of treason. But you cannot kill a legacy with an axe. As the centuries passed, the raw hatred for Cromwell began to fade, replaced by a complex, uncomfortable fascination. The man was a paradox that the British psyche has never quite been able to resolve. To his enemies, he remains a monster. In Ireland, his name is still a curse, synonymous with the slaughter of Drogheda and the theft of a nation's land. To the Royalists, he was a regicide, a hypocrite who destroyed a king only to rule with a heavier hand. He was the man who banned Christmas, the joyless Puritan who tried to legislate the human soul. But to others, he was the father of British democracy. He was the man who proved that a king is not a god, but a servant of the state, answerable to the people. He was the genius who created the British Army, transforming a rabble into a professional force that would eventually shape the modern world. He championed liberty of conscience, at least for Protestants, and allowed the Jews to return to England after centuries of banishment. Today, if you walk past the Houses of Parliament, you will find him still standing there. In 1899, a statue of Oliver Cromwell was erected outside Westminster Hall. It was controversial then, and it is controversial now. He stands not in the pose of a ruler, but of a soldier. He wears his riding boots and his spurs. In one hand, he clutches a Bible. In the other, he rests his hand on the hilt of his sword. He stands with his back to the Parliament he dismissed, staring out at the traffic, stern and immovable. He is the great bad man of British history. We cannot love him, for he was too hard, too bloody, too absolute, but we cannot ignore him, for he forged the nation in the fire of his own conviction. The story of the farmer who became a dictator is the story of England itself, a struggle between order and liberty, between the crown and the commons, between the sword and the law. And as long as that statue stands, clutching its sword and its scripture, the legacy of Oliver Cromwell will remain, like the man himself, unresolved, a dark, towering shadow cast across the history of the world.